The Man in the High Castle, Cassette 3.
Chapter 6. Early in the morning, enjoying the cool, bright sunlight, Mrs. Juliana Frink did her grocery shopping. She strolled along the sidewalk, carrying the 2 brown paper bags, halting at each store to study the window displays. She took her time. Wasn't there something she was supposed to pick up at the drugstore? She wandered in. Her shift at the judo parlor did not begin until noon. This was her free time today. Seating herself on a stool at the counter, she put down her shopping bags and began to go over the different magazines. The New Life, she saw, had a big article called Television in Europe, Glimpse of Tomorrow. Turning to it, interested, she saw a picture of a German family watching television in their living room. Already, the article said, there was 4 hours of image broadcast during the day from Berlin. Someday there would be television stations in all the major European cities, and by 1970, one would be built in New York. The article showed Reich electronic engineers at the New York site helping the local personnel with their problems. It was easy to tell which were the Germans. They had that healthy, clean, energetic, assured look. The Americans, on the other hand, they just looked like people. They could have been anybody. One of the German technicians could be seen pointing off somewhere, and the Americans were trying to make out what he was pointing at. I guess their eyesight is better than ours, she decided. Better diet over the last 20 years. As we've been told, they can see things no one else can. Vitamin A, perhaps? I wonder what it's like to sit home in your living room and see the whole world on a little gray glass tube. If those Nazis can fly back and forth between here and Mars, why can't they get television going? I think I'd prefer that, to watch those comedy shows, actually see what Bob Hope and Durante look like, than to walk around on Mars. Maybe that's it, she thought as she put the magazine back on the rack. The Nazis have no sense of humor, so why should they want television? Anyhow, they killed most of the really great comedians, because most of them were Jewish. In fact, she realized, they killed off most of the entertainment field. I wonder how Hope gets away with what he says. Of course he has to broadcast from Canada, and it's a little freer up there, but Hope really says things. Like the joke about Göring, the one where Göring buys Rome and has it shipped to his mountain retreat and then set up again, and revives Christianity so his pet lions will have something to... Did you want to buy that magazine, miss? The little dried-up old man who ran the drugstore called, with suspicion. Guiltily she put down the Reader's Digest, which she had begun to thumb through. Again, strolling along the sidewalk with her shopping bags, Juliana thought, maybe Göring will be the new Führer when that Bormann dies. He seems sort of different from the others. The only way that Bormann got it in the first place was to weasel in when Hitler realized how fast he was going. Old Göring was off in his mountain palace. Göring should have been Führer after Hitler, because it was his Luftwaffe that knocked out those English radar stations and then finished off the RAF. Hitler would have had them bomb London like they did Rotterdam. But probably Goebbels will get it, she decided. That was what everyone said, as long as that awful Heydrich doesn't. He'd kill us all. He's really bats. The one I like, she thought, is that Baldur von Schirach. He's the only one who looks normal anyhow. But he hasn't got a chance. Turning, she ascended the steps to the front door of the old wooden building in which she lived. When she unlocked the door of her apartment, she saw Joe Sinadella still lying where she had left him, in the center of the bed, on his stomach, his arms dangling. He was still asleep. No, she thought, he can't still be here. The truck's gone. Did he miss it? Obviously. Going into the kitchen, she set her grocery bags on the table among the breakfast dishes. But did he intend to miss it? She asked herself. That's what I wonder. What a peculiar man. He had been so active with her, going on almost all night. And yet it had been as if he were not actually there, doing it but never being aware. Thoughts on something else, maybe. From habit, she began putting food away in the old GE turret-top refrigerator. And then she began clearing the breakfast table. Maybe he's done it so much, she decided. It's second nature. His body makes the motions, like mine now as I put these plates and silver in the sink. Could do it with 3/5 of his brain removed, like the leg of a frog in biology class. "Hey," she called, "wake up." In the bed, Joe stirred, snorted. "Did you hear the Bob Hope show the other night?" she called. "He told this really funny joke, the one where this German major is interviewing some Martians. The Martians can't provide racial documentation about their grandparents being Aryan, you know, so the German major reports back to Berlin that Mars is populated by Jews." Coming into the living room where Joe lay in the bed, she said, "And they're about 1 foot tall and have 2 heads. You know how Bob Hope goes on." Joe had opened his eyes. He said nothing. He stared at her unwinkingly. His chin black with stubble, his dark, ache-filled eyes. She also became quiet then. "What is it?" she said at last. "Are you afraid?" No, she thought. That's Frank who's afraid. This is... I don't know what. "The rig went on," Joe said, sitting up. "What are you going to do?" She seated herself on the edge of the bed, drying her arms and hands with the dish-towel. "I'll catch him on the return. He won't say anything to anybody. He knows I'd do the same for him." "You've done this before?" she asked. Joe did not answer. "You meant to miss it," Juliana said to herself. "I can tell. All at once I know." "Suppose he takes another route back," she said. "He always take 50, never 40. He had an accident on 40 once. Some horses got out in the road, and he plowed into them in the Rockies." Picking up his clothes from the chair, he began to dress. "How old are you, Joe?" she asked as she contemplated his naked body. 34. Then, she thought, you must have been in a war. She saw no obvious physical defects. He had, in fact, quite a good, lean body with long legs. Joe, seeing her scrutiny, scowled and turned away. "Can't I watch?" she asked, wondering why not. All night with him, and then this modesty. "Are we bugs?" she said. "We can't stand the sight of each other in the daylight. We have to squeeze into the walls." Grunting sourly, he started toward the bathroom in his underpants and socks, rubbing his chin. "This is my home," Juliana thought. "I'm letting you stay here, and yet you won't allow me to look at you. Why do you want to stay, then?" She followed after him into the bathroom. He had begun running hot water in the bowl to shave. On his arm, she saw a tattoo, a blue letter C. "What's that?" she asked. "Your wife? Connie? Corinne?" Joe, washing his face, said, "Cairo." What an exotic name, she thought with envy. And then she felt herself flush. "I'm really stupid," she said. An Italian, 34 years old, from the Nazi part of the world. He had been in the war, all right, but on the Axis side. And he had fought at Cairo. The tattoo was their bond, the German and Italian veterans of that campaign, the defeat of the British and Australian army under General Gott at the hands of Rommel and his Africa Corps. She left the bathroom, returned to the living room, and began making the bed. Her hands flew. In a neat stack on the chair lay Joe's possessions, clothes and small suitcase, personal articles. Among them she noticed a velvet-covered box, a little like a glasses case. Picking it up, she opened it and peeked inside. You certainly did fight at Cairo, she thought as she gazed down at the Iron Cross Second Class with the word and the date June 10th, 1945, engraved at its top. They didn't all get this. Only the valiant ones. I wonder what you did. You were only 17 years old then. Joe appeared at the door of the bathroom just as she lifted the medal from its velvet box. She became aware of him and jumped guiltily. But he did not seem angry. "I was just looking at it," Juliana said. "I've never seen one before. Did Rommel pin it on you himself?" "General Bayerlane gave them out. Rommel had already been transferred to England to finish up there." His voice was calm, but his hand once more had begun the monotonous pawing at his forehead, fingers digging into his scalp in that combing motion which seemed to be a chronic nervous tic. "Would you tell me about it?" Juliana asked, as he returned to the bathroom and his shaving. As he shaved, and after that took a long hot shower, Joe Sinadella told her a little, nothing like the sort of account she would have liked to hear. His two older brothers had served in the Ethiopian campaign, while he, at 13, had been in a fascist youth organization in Milan, his hometown. Later, his brothers had joined a crack artillery battery, that of Major Riccardo Pardi, and when World War II began, Joe had been able to join them. They had fought under Graziani. Their equipment, especially their tanks, had been dreadful. The British had shot them down, even senior officers, like rabbits. Doors of the tanks had to be held shut with sandbags during battle to keep them from flying open. Major Pardi, however, had reclaimed discarded artillery shells, polished and greased them, and fired them. His battery had halted General Wavell's great desperate tank advance in 43. "Are your brothers still alive?" Juliana asked. His brothers had been killed in 44, strangled with wire by British commandos. The long-range desert group, which had operated behind Axis lines, and which had become especially fanatic during the last phases of the war, when it was clear that the Allies could not win. "How do you feel about the British now?" she asked haltingly. Joe said, "I'd like to see them do to England what they did in Africa." His tone was flat. "But it's been 18 years, Juliana said. "I know the British especially did terrible things, but they talk about the things the Nazis did to the Jews," Joe said. "The British have done worse. In the Battle of London." He became silent. "Those fire weapons, phosphorus and oil. I saw a few of the German troops afterward, boat after boat burned to a cinder. Those pipes under the water turned the sea to fire. And on civilian populations, by those mass firebombing raids that Churchill thought were going to save the war at the last moment, those terror attacks on Hamburg and Essen and—" "Let's not talk about it," Juliana said. In the kitchen, she started cooking bacon. She turned on the small white plastic Emerson radio, which Frank had given her on her birthday. "I'll fix you something to eat." She dialed, trying to find some light, pleasant music. "Look at this," Joe said. In the living room, he sat on the bed, his small suitcase beside him. He had opened it and brought out a ragged, bent book which showed signs of much handling. He grinned at Juliana. "Come here. You know what somebody says? This man," he indicated the book. "This is very funny. Sit down." He took hold of her arm, drew her down beside him. "I want to read to you. Suppose they had won, what would it be like? We don't have to worry. This man has done all the thinking for us." Opening the book, Joe began turning pages slowly. "The British Empire would control all Europe, all the Mediterranean. No Italy at all. No Germany either. Bobbies and those funny little soldiers in tall fur hats, and the king as far as the Volga." In a low voice, Juliana said, "Would that be so bad?" "You read the book?" "No," she admitted, peering to see the cover. She had heard about it, though. A lot of people were reading it. "But Frank and I, my former husband and I, often talked about how it would have been if the Allies had won the war." Joe did not seem to hear her. He was staring down at the copy of The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. "And in this," he went on, "you know how it is that England wins, beats the Axis?" She shook her head, feeling the growing tension of the man beside her. His chin now had begun to quiver. He licked his lips again and again, dug at his scalp. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "He has Italy betray the Axis," Joe said. "Oh." "Italy goes over to the Allies, joins the Anglo-Saxons, and opens up what he calls the soft underbelly of Europe. But that's natural for him to think that. We all know the cowardly Italian army that ran every time they saw the British drinking vino. Happy-go-lucky, not made for fighting. This fellow—" Joe closed the book, turned it around to study the back cover. "Abenson. I don't blame him. He writes this fantasy. Imagines how the world would be if the Axis had lost. How else could they lose except by Italy being a traitor?" His voice grated. "The Duce. He was a clown. We all know that." "I have to turn the bacon." She slid away from him and hurried back to the kitchen. Following after her, still carrying the book, Joe went on. "And the U.S. comes in, after it licks the Japs. And after the war, the U.S. and Britain divide the world, exactly like Germany and Japan did in reality." Juliana said, "Germany, Japan, and Italy." He stared at her. "You left out Italy." She faced him calmly. "Did you forget, too?" she said to herself, "like everybody else? The little empire in the Middle East, the musical comedy New Rome?" Presently she served him a platter of bacon and eggs, toast and marmalade, coffee. He ate readily. "What did they serve you in North Africa?" she asked, as she, too, seated herself. Joe said, "Dead donkey." "That's hideous." With a twisted grin, Joe said, "Asino morte." The bully beef cans had the initials AM stamped on them. The Germans called it Alter Mann, old man. He resumed his rapid eating. "I would like to read this," Juliana thought as she reached to take the book from under Joe's arm. Will he be here that long? The book had grease on it. Pages were torn, finger marks all over it. Read by truck drivers on a long haul, she thought. In the one-arm beaneries late at night. "I'll bet you're a slow reader," she thought. "I'll bet you've been poring over this book for weeks, if not months." Opening the book at random, she read, "Now in his old age he viewed tranquillity, domain such as the ancients would have coveted but not comprehended, ships from the Crimea to Madrid, and all the empire, all with the same coin, speech, flag. The great old Union Jack dipping from sunrise to sunset. It had been fulfilled at last, that about the sun and the flag. "The only book I carry around," Juliana said, "isn't actually a book. It's the Oracle, the I Ching. Frank got me hooked on it, and I use it all the time to decide. I never let it out of my sight, ever." She closed the copy of The Grasshopper. "Want to see it? Want to use it?" "No," Joe said. Resting her chin on her folded arms on the table surface and gazing at him sideways, she said, "Have you moved in here permanently? And what are you up to?" Brooding over the insults, the slanders. "You petrify me," she thought, "with your hatred of life. But you have something. You're like a little animal, not important but smart." Studying his limited, clever, dark face, she thought, how could I ever have imagined you as younger than me? But even that's true, your childishness. You are still the baby brother, worshipping your two older brothers and your Major Pardee and General Rommel, panting and sweating to break loose and get the Tommies. Did they actually garrote your brothers with loops of wire? We heard that, the atrocity stories and photos released after the war. She shuddered. But the British commandos were brought to trial and punished long ago. The radio had ceased playing music. There seemed to be a news program, racket of short wave from Europe. The voice faded and became garbled. A long pause, nothing at all, just silence. Then the Denver announcer, very clear, close by. She reached to turn the dial, but Joe stopped her hand. News of Chancellor Bormann's death shocked a stunned Germany, which had been assured as recently as yesterday. She and Joe jumped to their feet. All Reich stations cancelled scheduled programs, and listeners heard the solemn strains of the chorus of the SS Division Das Reich raised in the anthem of the Partei, the Horst Wessel-Lied. Later in Dresden were the acting Partei secretary and chiefs of the Sicherheitsdienst, the National Security Police, which replaced the Gestapo following— Joe turned the volume up— reorganization of the government at the instigation of the late Reichsfuhrer Himmler, Albert Speer, and others. 2 weeks of official mourning were declared, and already many shops and businesses have closed, it was reported. As yet no word has come as to the expected convening of the Reichstag, the formal parliament of the Third Reich, whose approval is required. "It'll be Heydrich," Joe said. "I wish it would be that big blond fellow, that Schirach," she said. "Christ, so he finally died. Do you think Schirach has a chance?" "No," Joe said shortly. "Maybe there'll be a civil war now," she said. "But those guys are so old now, Göring and Goebbels, all those old party boys." The radio was saying, "Reached at his retreat in the Alps near Brenner," Joe said, "this'll be Fat Hellman." Said merely that he was grief-stricken by the loss not only of a soldier and patriot and faithful Partei leader, but also, as he has said many times over, of a personal friend whom, one will recall, he backed in the interregnum dispute shortly after the war, when it appeared for a time that elements hostile to Herr Bormann's ascension to supreme authority— Juliana shut the radio off. "They're just babbling," she said. "Why do they use words like that? Those terrible murderers are talked about as if they were like the rest of us." "They are like us," Joe said. He reseated himself and once more ate. "There isn't anything they've done we wouldn't have done if we'd been in their places. They saved the world from communism. We'd be living under Red rule now if it wasn't for Germany. We'd be worse off." "You're just talking," Juliana said. "Like the radio, babbling." "I've been living under the Nazis," Joe said. "I know what it's like. Is that just talk? To live 12, 13 years, longer than that, almost 15 years? I got a work card from OT. I worked for Organisation Tot since 1947 in North Africa and the USA. Listen." He jabbed his finger at her. "I got the Italian genius for earthworks. OT gave me a high rating. I wasn't shoveling asphalt and mixing a concrete for the autobahns. I was a helping design engineer. One day Dr. Tot came by and inspected what our work crew did. He said to me, 'You got good hands.' That's a big moment, Juliana. Dignity of labor. They're not talking only words. Before them, the Nazis. Everyone looked down on manual jobs. Myself, too. Aristocratic. The Labor Front put an end to that. I seen in my own hands for the first time." He spoke so swiftly that his accent began to take over. She had trouble understanding him. "We all lived out there in the woods in upper-state New York like brothers, sang the songs, marched to work, spirit of the war, only rebuilding, not breaking down. Those were the best days of all, rebuilding after the war, fine, clean, long-lasting rows of public buildings block by block, whole new downtown. New York and Baltimore. Now, of course, that work's past. Big cartels like New Jersey, Krupp, and Zonen running the show. But that's not Nazi. That's just old European powerful. Worse, you hear? Nazis like Rommel and Todt, 1,000,000 times better men than industrialists like Krupp and bankers, all those Prussians. Ought to have been gassed. All those gentlemen in vests." But Juliana thought, those gentlemen in vests are in forever. And your idols, Rommel and Dr. Todt, they just came in after hostilities to clear the rubble, build the autobahns, start industry humming. They even let the Jews live. Lucky surprise. Amnesty so the Jews could pitch in. Until 49, anyhow. And then goodbye, Todt and Rommel. Retired to graze. "Don't I know?" Juliana thought. Didn't I hear all about it from Frank? You can't tell me anything about life under the Nazis. My husband is a Jew. I know that Dr. Todt was the most modest gentleman that ever lived. I know all he wanted to do was provide work, honest, reputable work, for the millions of bleak-eyed, despairing American men and women picking through the ruins after the war. I know he wanted to see medical plans and vacation resorts and adequate housing for everyone, regardless of race. He was a builder, not a thinker. In most cases he managed to create what he had wanted. He actually got it, but... A preoccupation in the back of her mind now rose decidedly. "Joe, this grasshopper book, isn't it banned in the East Coast?" He nodded. "How could you be reading it then?" Something about it worried her. "Don't they still shoot people for reading?" "It depends on your racial group. On the good old armband." That was so. Slavs, Poles, Puerto Ricans were the most limited as to what they could read, do, listen to. The Anglo-Saxons had it much better. There was public education for their children, and they could go to libraries and museums and concerts. But even so, the grasshopper was not merely classified. It was forbidden, and to everyone. Joe said, "I read it in the toilet. I hid it in a pillow. In fact, I read it because it was banned." "You're very brave," she said. Doubtfully, he said, "You mean that sarcastically?" "No." He relaxed a little. "It's easy for you people here. You live a safe, purposeless life, nothing to do, nothing to worry about. Out of the stream of events left over from the past, right?" His eyes mocked her. "You're killing yourself," she said, "with cynicism. Your idols got taken away from you one by one, and now you have nothing to give your love to." She held his fork toward him. He accepted it. Eat, she thought, or give up even the biological processes. As he ate, Joe nodded at the book and said, "That Abinson lives around here, according to the cover. In Cheyenne. Gets perspective on the world from such a safe spot, wouldn't you guess? Read what it says. Read it aloud." Taking the book, she read the back part of the jacket. "He's an ex-serviceman. He was in the U.S. Marine Corps in World War II, wounded in England by a Nazi Tiger tank. A sergeant. It says he's got practically a fortress that he writes in, guns all over the place." Setting the book down, she said, "And it doesn't say so here, but I heard someone say that he's almost a sort of paranoid. Charged barbed wire around the place, and it's set in the mountains, hard to get to." "Maybe he's right," Joe said, "to live like that, after writing that book. The German bigwigs hit the roof when they read it. He was living that way before. He wrote the book there. His place is called—" She glanced at the book jacket. "The High Castle. That's his pet name for it." "They won't get him," Joe said, chewing rapidly. "He's on the lookout. Smart." She said, "I believe he's got a lot of courage to write that book. If the Axis had lost the war, we'd be able to say and write anything we wanted, like we used to. We'd be one country, and we'd have a fair legal system, the same one for all of us." To her surprise, he nodded reasonably to that. "I don't understand you," she said. "What do you believe? What is it you want? You defend those monsters, those freaks who slaughtered the Jews, and then you—" Despairing, she caught hold of him by the ears. He blinked in surprise and pain as she rose to her feet, tugging him up with her. They faced each other, wheezing, neither able to speak. "Let me finish this meal you fixed for me," Joe said at last. "Won't you say? You won't tell me? You do know what it is yourself. You understand, and you just go on eating, pretending you don't have any idea what I mean." She let go of his ears. They had been twisted until they were now bright red. "Empty talk," Joe said. "It doesn't matter, like the radio, what you said of it. You know the old brown-shirt term for people who spin philosophy? Eierkopf. Egghead. Because the big double-domed empty heads break so easily in the street brawls. If you feel like that about me, Juliana said, why don't you go on? What are you staying here for? His enigmatic grimace chilled her. I wish I had never let him come with me, she thought. And now it's too late. I know I can't get rid of him. He's too strong. Something terrible is happening, she thought, coming out of him. And I seem to be helping it. What's the matter? He reached out, chucked her beneath the chin, stroked her neck, put his fingers under her shirt, and pressed her shoulders affectionately. A mood. Your problem, I'll analyze you free. They'll call you a Jew analyst. She smiled feebly. Do you want to wind up in an oven? You're scared of men, right? I don't know. It was possible to tell last night. Only because He cut his sentence off. Because I took special care to notice your wants. Because you've gone to bed with so many girls, Juliana said. That's what you started to say. But I know I'm right. Listen. I'll never hurt you, Juliana. On my mother's body, I give you my word. I'll be specially considerate. And if you want to make an issue out of my experience, I'll give you the advantage of that. You'll lose your jitters. I can relax you and improve you in not very much time, either. You've just had bad luck. She nodded, cheered a bit. But she still felt cold and sad, and she still did not know quite why. To begin his day, Mr. Nobusuke Tagomi took a moment to be alone. He sat in his office in the Nippon Times building and contemplated. Already, before he had left his house to come to his office, he had received Ito's report on Mr. Baines. There was no doubt in the young student's mind Mr. Baines was not a Swede. Mr. Baines was most certainly a German national. But Ito's ability to handle Germanic languages had never impressed either the trade missions or the Tokoka, the Japanese secret police. The fool possibly has sniffed out nothing to speak of, Mr. Tagomi thought to himself. Maladroit enthusiasm combined with romantic doctrines. Detect, always with suspicion. Anyhow, the conference with Mr. Baines and the elderly individual from the home islands would begin soon, in due course, whatever national Mr. Baines was. And Mr. Tagomi liked the man. That was, he decided, conceivably the basic talent of the man highly placed, such as himself. To know a good man when he met him. Intuition about people. Cut through all ceremony and outward form. Penetrate to the heart. The heart locked within two yin lines of black passion. Strangled sometimes, and yet even then the light of yang, the flicker at the center. I like him, Mr. Tagomi said to himself. German or Swede. I hope the Zaricane helped his headache. Must recall to inquire, first off the bat. His desk intercom buzzed. No, he said brusquely into it. No discussion. This is moment for inner truth, introversion. From the tiny speaker, Mr. Ramsey's voice. Sir, news has just come from the press service below. The Reichs-Chancellor is dead. Martin Bormann. Ramsey's voice popped off. Silence. Mr. Tagomi thought, cancel all business for today. He rose from his desk and paced rapidly back and forth, pressing his hands together. Let me see. Dispatch at once. Formal note to Reichskonsul. Minor item. Subordinate can accomplish. Deep sorrow, etc. All Japan joins with German people in this sad hour. Then, become vitally receptive. Must be in position to receive information from Tokyo instantly. Pressing the intercom button, he said, Mr. Ramsey, be sure we are through to Tokyo. Tell the switchboard girls, be alert, must not miss communication. Yes, sir, Mr. Ramsey said. I will be in my office from now on. Thwart all routine matters. Turn back any and all callers whose business is customary. Sir, my hands must be free in case sudden activity is needed. Yes, sir. Half an hour later, at 9, a message arrived from the highest-ranking Imperial government official on the West Coast, the Japanese ambassador to the Pacific States of America, the Honorable Baron L.B. Kaelamakule. The Foreign Office had called an extraordinary session at the Embassy building on Sutter Street, and each trade mission was to send a highly placed personage to attend. In this case, it meant Mr. Tagomi himself. There was no time to change clothes. Mr. Tagomi hurried to the express elevator, descended to the ground floor, and a moment later was on his way by mission limousine, a black 1940 Cadillac driven by an experienced uniformed Chinese chauffeur. At the Embassy building he found other dignitaries' cars parked round about, a dozen in all. Highly placed worthies, some of whom he knew, some of whom were strangers to him, could be seen ascending the wide steps of the Embassy building, filing on inside. Mr. Tagomi's chauffeur held the door open, and he stepped out quickly, gripping his briefcase. It was empty, because he had no papers to bring, but it was essential to avoid appearance of being mere spectator. He strode up the steps in a manner suggesting a vital role in the happenings, although actually he had not even been told what this meeting would cover. Small knots of personages had gathered, murmured discussions in the lobby. Mr. Tagomi joined several individuals whom he knew, nodding his head and looking, with them, solemn. An embassy employee appeared presently and directed them into a large hall. Chairs set up, folding type. All persons filed in, seated themselves silently except for coughing and shuffling. Talk had ceased. Toward the front, a gentleman with handful of papers making way up to slightly raised table. Striped pants. Representative from Foreign Office. Bit of confusion. Other personages discussing in low tones, heads bowed together. Sirs, the Foreign Office person said in a loud, commanding voice, all eyes fixed then on him. As you know, the Reichskanzler is now confirmed as dead. Official statement from Berlin. This meeting, which will not last long, you will soon be able to go back to your offices, is for purposes of informing you of our evaluation of several contending factions in German political life, who can now be expected to step forth and engage in no-holds-barred disputation for spot evacuated by Herr Bormann. Briefly, the notables. The foremost, Hermann Göring. Bear with familiar details, please. The fat one, so-called, due to body, originally courageous air ace in First World War, founded Gestapo and held post in Prussian government of vast power. One of the most ruthless early Nazis, yet later Sybaritic excesses gave rise to misguiding picture of amiable, wine-tippling disposition, which our government urges you to reject. This man, although said to be unhealthy, possibly even morbidly so in terms of appetites, resembles more the self-gratifying ancient Roman Caesars, whose power grew rather than abated as age progressed. Lurid picture of this person in toga with pet lions, owning immense castle filled with trophies and art objects, is no doubt accurate. Freight trains of stolen valuables made way to his private estates over military needs in wartime. Our evaluation. This man craves enormous power, and is capable of obtaining it. Most self-indulgent of all Nazis, and is in sharp contrast to late H. Himmler, who lived in personal want at low salary. Herr Göring, representative of spoils mentality, using power as means of acquiring personal wealth. Primitive mentality, even vulgar, but quite intelligent man, possibly most intelligent of all Nazi chiefs. Object of his drives, self-glorification in ancient emperor fashion. Next, Herr J. Goebbels, suffered polio in youth, originally Catholic, brilliant orator, writer, flexible and fanatic mind, witty, urbane, cosmopolitan. much active with ladies, elegant, educated, highly capable, does much work, almost frenzied managerial drive, is said never to rest, much respected personage, can be charming, but is said to have rabid streak unmatched by other Nazis. Ideological orientation suggesting medieval Jesuitic viewpoint exacerbated by post-romantic Germanic nihilism. Considered sole authentic intellectual of the Partei. Had ambitions to be playwright in youth, few friends, not liked by subordinates, but nevertheless highly polished product of many best elements in European culture. Not self-gratification is underlying ambition, but power for its use purely. Organizational attitude in classic Prussian state sense.
This ends side 1 of cassette 3. Please turn the cassette over and start side 2 at the same point.